Well, CMS has some very important roles to play, both at the global and national level. At the global level, CMS brings together the range states of those species that are listed on CMS. And it makes sure that those range states, which are parties to the convention, then take measures to conserve the species and their habitats. So like CITES, CMS is a species-based convention, and in fact, it is one of the two only species-based global conventions that there are. And it works very similar like CITES. CMS also has two appendices, Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, under which parties select specific species that are endangered or that they think should, deserve or need concerted actions and cooperation to being conserved. So while Appendix 1 lists those species that require very strict protection because they are endangered, and that means they are threatened by extinction, Appendix 2 lists some species that only require cooperative action to be protected. Now, what actually constitutes a migratory species and therefore is eligible for being listed on CMS is defined also by the convention. And here the convention takes a very different approach than the biological definition of migratory species. So the legal definition of migratory species is much broader than the biological definition. And it covers those species of which we know travel for very, very long distances, like birds that migrate from Europe to Africa and vice versa. Or aquatic species that like sharks or whales that travel through the different oceans. It also covers terrestrial species that may not be known as migratory species under the biological definition. So for example, CMS now also covers gorillas that have transboundary populations, or it also covers lions and leopards and cheetahs, which again, one would not think that they are migratory species, but the legal definition of CMS allows the listing of those species as a migratory species under the convention. So in summary, we can say that CMS provides or gives a passport to those species to be able to travel freely from one country to the other. And as such, this is a very important instrument. We know that the IPBES report has shown that species are on a very steep decline, and the reasons for that are direct exploitation, but also habitat loss. So both of these threats are the threats that are directly being addressed by CMS. And CMS does not only, or the parties of CMS do not only list those species under the convention, but in addition to that, they also adopt resolutions and decisions which address very specific challenges and threats that those species encounter. So for example, when it comes to renewable energy installations, as we all know, wind turbines are a big threat for birds or bats that get caught in them and then killed. Or the CMS COP has also passed resolutions on how to avoid bycatch of certain species like sharks and turtles, of course. It also has some adopted decisions on addressing the use of species as wild meat, because that is a very important threat to a lot of African but also Latin American species. And it has started to look into the development of infrastructure, in particular linear infrastructure, which cuts across species habitats and therefore impedes the migration of those species. But it does not only work through the listing of the species and the resolution decisions. The COP also adopts some action plans on either specific species or groups of species, which then set out very specific conservation measures that the parties that are range states of these species have to implement. And of course, the CMS convention set up does not only consist of the Conference of the Parties as the main decision-making organ of the convention, but it also has a scientific council which provides scientific advice to the parties, and that meets on a regular basis and provides the technical input and advice for the convention. So so much about the global role of CMS. With regards to the national role, it is very important that countries can, when they interact with different sectors at the national level, let's say the mining sector, but also economic sector, tourism, and so on, that they can refer to the commitments that the country has made at the global level to then actually also take action at the national level. So the convention, through its obligations, provides a very, very important and, of course, legally binding reference point for the ministries of environment. And so it is important that the ministries of environment, which are the main focal points for the convention, are then also going out to the agricultural, fisheries ministries, energy, and so on, and that they say, well, this is what we have committed to, and therefore we also have to consider species protection within these other sectors. So the convention has certainly shown success, because today there are 131 parties or countries that have joined the convention as a party. So we clearly see that there's a big interest of parties to be part of this convention, and that they see also a lot of relevance in being a party to that convention. We have also seen that in the number of both legally binding but also non-legally binding instruments that parties have concluded under the umbrella of the convention, that they are making active use of this global instrument. So just to give you an example of some of the legally binding agreements that parties have concluded is the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, which I think you will also be briefed upon by a colleague of mine, but also one that is much smaller, which is the Gorilla Agreement, that only brings together the gorilla range states, and at the moment 8 of the 10 range states have become party to the CMS Gorilla Agreement. And in total, there are now 7 legally binding agreements and 19 non-legally binding agreements, which are called Memoranda of Understanding. And these Memoranda of Understanding, well, some of the examples of such MOUs are one that is also global, which is for the protection and conservation of the dugong. Then there is one for raptors. We also have one specifically for sharks. And then there is a regionally limited MOU for marine turtles that covers the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia region. Yes, so in addition to that, there are now about 179 species only listed on Appendix 1. So that shows that quite a large number of species do require this strict protection that CMS provides to them. But also the trust and the trust that countries bring to the convention, in that they say we need to actually list this species for its protection. Apart, apart from these official agreements, CMS parties have also started to create certain species initiatives. So very recently, the parties decided to set up a joint African Carnivores Initiative, joint between CMS and CITES, and that is currently developing a very dedicated program of work, which which hopefully we will combine with a sustainable funding mechanism that will then support African parties in conserving their populations of lion, leopard, cheetah, and African wild dog. Then another project that is ongoing is under the Dugong MOU, which seeks to support countries in conserving their seagrass areas. And that is also financed with CHEF funding, actually. And is one of the successes that we can cite. And we have, at the beginning of this year, started a project specifically in the Eastern and Southern African region to support parties in setting up transfrontier conservation areas. And again, here we will take an ecosystems approach and try to support parties in managing multiple use areas, so that the connectivity of these ecosystem is maintained, and the species that occur there are conserved. Some of the challenges that CMS faces is certainly that of the parties' capacity to implement the agreements, and that is human capacity, that is the knowledge, having scientific data at hand to actually implement the convention. But it is also financing that is required to do to carry out the implementation on the ground. And something that CMS, as opposed to other conventions, is missing is a sanctioning mechanism or enforcement mechanism. So yeah, that has been some of the challenges of CMS. In terms of the membership of CMS, I think again, to reach a truly global coverage, we are also still lacking the membership of some very important countries, which includes the United States, but also China, Japan, the Russian Federation, yeah, just to mention some of the big countries. Yes, so that is really only summarizing what I have already mentioned. We can see that the lack of capacity or funding is, of course, a challenge to implementation, and regions that do have less resources are, of course, then also unfortunately not in a position to implement the convention as well as others. But that said, even Europe, which in certain parts, has, of course, is much better equipped to implement the convention from a technical and financial perspective. If the political will is not there, then that is obviously also a challenge to implementation. So partners are extremely important for the implementation of CMS, as just for any other MEA. And that is, and in particular, I think the collaboration of these different partners is really key to the successful implementation of CMS. Of course, governments are the ones that have subscribed to the party, so they hold the legal responsibility to also implement them, and they have to make sure that the required legislation is being passed by their parliaments to implement the convention, and if required, that also enforcement mechanisms are in place then to enforce the national legislation that they have passed to implement the convention. So, of course, they take a very key and central role in that process. But scientific bodies or academia is just as important, because they have to provide, or we are reliant on academia to provide the scientific data, scientific information that that builds the basis for informed decision making by the convention. So we at CMS, the scientific council is composed of scientific representatives from each of the countries, and here it is really key that they also contribute their knowledge to and advice to support the decision making of the convention. And then the third categories was some NGOs, I think, IGOs, yeah. So yes, then again, as many governments, on the one hand, maybe lack resources to implement their obligations on the ground, partnering with IGOs or NGOs is very important, and at the same time, also NGOs and IGOs, can raise awareness of issues that might not be, so good for the species, and that they bring to the attention of the governments, but also the convention, where there is any non-compliance with the convention. Some other actors that are also important for this collaboration is the private sector, the development sector, regional or global development banks, and any other sponsors that can provide resources for implementation on the ground. And another group of stakeholders, I think, are local communities and indigenous people. We have to, of course, look also at their interests, but also their needs, and include them in the implementation, as well as consider their interests in the decision making of the COP. And contrary to other conventions, CMS actually does not have an official mechanism that takes into consideration the interests of local communities and indigenous people. CMS has a number of tools that its parties have set up to monitor the implementation of the convention, and also measure it and enhance its implementation. So one of the instruments that is already enshrined in the convention text is the national reporting, and that is a triennial exercise by which the parties to the convention have to submit their national reports 180 days, I think it is, prior to each of the COPs, COP meetings, and report on how they have implemented the convention. And there's a specific national report format that is being developed by the scientists, but also the Secretariat, and then adopted by the Conference of the Parties, which the parties can then use and answer, and that provides us with a very good overview of the implementation by each of the parties, but also at the aggregate level of the general implementation of the convention in all jurisdictions. Then a second tool that was only set up by the 12th meeting of the Conference of Parties is the National Legislation Program. And this is a voluntary program by which parties can receive support to actually implement the obligations that they have committed to at the national level. So a questionnaire is being sent around to the parties, and which they then, fill in to show the level of implementation of the convention at the national level. And it is then being looked at by the Secretariat colleagues and assessed. And if the level of implementation is not enough, then the Secretariat will support the party in developing appropriate legislation that will effectively implement the convention at the national level. Also set up by the 12th meeting of the Conference Parties is the review mechanism, which essentially is a compliance mechanism, only that it does not really have very strong sanctioning measures. So this review mechanism allows parties, but also NGOs and the Secretariat to bring up issues of non-compliance in a specific party and bring it to the attention of the standing committee, which will act as the review committee for that specific case. And together with the country in which the case has arisen, the standing committee will then develop some solutions to address the issue. So rather than, trying to punish a country for not complying with the convention, this is a facilitative and non-adversarial approach to help countries to be compliant with the convention. So far, we have not actually had a case to bring to the attention of the standing committee in its capacity as the review committee, but we hope that this mechanism is being used at some point by any stakeholder. And a last tool that we also use is the strategic plan, which also has very specific targets, and parties, when they report in the national reports, then they also show of how they have achieved the certain targets that are set out in the strategic plan. So first of all, I should say that it's not actually always easy to receive the national reports from the parties. Sometimes it, again, may be an issue of capacity. Sometimes maybe, there are other reasons, but we have never, unfortunately, received the national reports of all parties, of all countries that are party to the convention. So I think on average, we receive for each of the COPs between 80 and 95, something like that, national reports, which is a bit of a shame. Yeah, but we are working also on better supporting parties in preparing the national reports. Then we are analyzing the responses that we receive for these national reports, and then prepare sort of an overview report on very specific issues that are being addressed in the national reports to, provide an overall assessment of how the convention has been implemented. The Secretariat can also use the national reports as a source of information to trigger a case in the review mechanism. Yes, but this we have not yet done. Yeah, this has definitely been very important also for CMS, and because it really speaks also to the heart of the convention. The objective of the convention is really to address the causes of zoonosis, you can say, because it seeks to tackle the direct use of endangered species, but also it seeks to ensure that the connectivity between ecosystems and habitats is maintained. And these are exactly the reasons and causes for zoonotic diseases to spread on humans. Yeah, while CMS of course also acknowledges that the meat of wild animals might be a very important source of protein for some local communities and indigenous peoples, it is very important that this use is sustainable. And at the moment, the current trade is definitely not sustainable. So we also work with partners to address that issue, to make sure that that the consumption of wild meat remains within the local communities, and that wild meat is not being transported from the bush to the cities where it is then being consumed as luxury goods. Yeah, so that is certainly very important for the convention, and bats, of which very many are listed on CMS, have obviously also been one of the species that were highlighted in this pandemic as possibly being the animals that have transmitted the disease to humans. And CMS has informed the public and raised the awareness of public that bats are completely, that as long as bats are being kept in their environments and not being interfered with in any way, that they are actually completely harmless and not any source of zoonotic diseases. The same, of course, with gorillas that are also thought of being potential transmitters for zoonotic diseases. And again, CMS is raising awareness that only as their habitat is being encroached upon by people, the opportunities for transmission actually occur. I think my main message is, first of all, it's great that they are participating in this course, because this is certainly very important, and I'm sure will help them a lot with implementing CMS. but also that we are, the CMS Secretariat is ready and is willing and yeah, in the situation to also support them if they need any support. So please come and contact us. We are ready to help.